Our evolving understanding of grief. Welcome. As we begin this module, let's do a quick review of what we know about grief and the grief process. Our understanding of grief has evolved significantly and is actually very different today from what was assumed in the past. The concept of grief that was popular for years was the notion that there is a sequence of stages that an individual must pass through in order to recover from the death of a loved one or from any significant emotional loss. In this notion, we thought that the grief process began with the shock of the death and then progressed through stages described as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Like many other stage theories, current research does not support this model for understanding grief. Another misunderstanding was that bereaved individuals should exhibit significant emotional and even physical distress after a loss. We now recognize that grief is a very individual experience, and some people actually experience little or no observable distress. In fact, many people seem to be resilient. Research has shown that there is a great variability in grief patterns. A variety of factors, including cultural views about grief, will influence survivors' grief reactions and processes. Yet another misunderstanding was the expectation that within some reasonable period of time after the loss, survivors should come to terms with the loss, recover from it, and resume their previous level of functioning. In fact, we now recognize that for most people, grief has no predictable endpoint. Using terms such as recovery and resolution, therefore, may actually be offensive to some survivors. Survivors typically describe grief as an ongoing process that involves reflecting on their life before the loss and integrating the loss into their life after it. Since grief is such an individual experience, when does so-called normal grief become abnormal? This question continues to challenge us. Some clinicians and researchers have tried to quantify grief as abnormal if a certain level of distress, serious emotional, behavioral, and cognitive symptoms, and/or impairment in functioning are seen for a certain period of time. Terms such as complicated grief, traumatic grief, unresolved grief, delayed grief, pathological grief, and prolonged grief have been used to try to describe this notion of grief gone awry. Current research indicates that only a minority of persons experiencing a major loss will exhibit chronic grief, that is, persistent grief symptoms, and may have difficulty finding ways to move forward. This chronic grief experience is more likely to occur when the loss involves some type of violence, such as in combat, or when various protective factors are lacking, or various risk factors are present in the life of the survivor. In such cases, grief is often compounded by other conditions such as major depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Two theoretical models explaining the grief process and coping with bereavement seem to be supported by current research and provide information that might be used to guide efforts to support survivors. The first is known as the four-component model of grief. To understand an individual's grieving process, it is important to examine the context in which the loss occurred, sudden or unexpected, timely or untimely, and cultural expectations. The subjective meanings associated with the loss. Does the bereaved eventually reappraise the loss in positive ways? Changes in the representation of the lost loved one over time. Does the bereaved maintain a helpful connection with the deceased? The role of coping processes that influence the stress of loss, such as emotion regulation and enhancing positive emotions such as laughter. These components interact over the grief course. This model suggests that adaptation or restoration is most likely when the survivor can minimize negative, dysfunctional emotions and enhance any positive emotions from the loss. The second model is known as the dual process model of coping with bereavement. The dual process model considers two grief-related challenges, one focusing on the loss of the loved one, and the other on restoring the ability to meet the challenges of the present and future without the loved one. To adapt, the survivor oscillates back and forth over time, at times confronting and at other times avoiding one or both of these challenges. In the days and weeks after the loss, a survivor is typically focused on trying to process the loss itself. Over time, Adapting to the loss results in more effort devoted to mastering life's challenges without the loved one. While our understanding of grief and adaptive strategies continues to advance with new research, there is very little research based on the grief experience of surviving military unit or family members. While we can draw on some of the research on traumatic loss and grief and apply this information to the military, there may be significant differences that we have yet to uncover or understand. The rest of this module digs deeper into a specific aspect of the grief process and provides some guidance on how Army chaplains can support survivors.